Hi, welcome back to Kiersti's Virtual Classroom. Today we are working on learning a little bit about environmental history. So here we're learning from what happened in the past, looking at some revolutions that occurred in Earth's history and human history, and seeing how that has an impact on the environment and what we see today with environmental issues. All right, so throughout time, we've had some major cultural changes take place. One of the biggest ones was the agricultural revolution. So, this is when we saw big agriculture crops and farming kind of move towards modern day farming. So, this happened about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. And then about 275 years ago, we saw the big industrial medical revolution, which probably had one of the biggest impacts on the environment we've seen to date. And then in about 50 years ago, we saw the information and globalization revolution. So this is getting the internet and more people connected than they had ever been connected before. Okay, so these changes have greatly increased our impact on the environment in three specific ways. So there is more energy and new technologies. The expansion of the human population has had a huge impact on the environment. We'll talk about that more in a module coming up. And then it has increased our resource use, pollution, and environmental degradation. So all of these things kind of intertwine, but the more energy we use and the more technologies that we have, the more human population we end up with, and the increase in human population will increase in our pollution and our environmental degradation. So, before modern day, most humans were hunter-gatherers. And you've probably been familiar with this term before, but this is the act of collecting wild plants, hunting, fishing, and scavenging for meat. They usually lived in very small groups and they worked together. Most of their work every day was so that they could survive. It wasn't like working to make money, to have a house, and all of these other things that you might want. This was specifically so that they could live. They moved seasonally to find food, and their populations grew really slowly because they had high infant mortality and they had a very short lifespan. So they did not live very long, and most of their young often didn't make it. So with advanced hunter-gatherers, they had a greater impact because they would use things like advanced tools and fire, and that ended up converting some of the forests into grasslands, and that had a negative effect on the environment. They may have also contributed to the extinction of some animals and altered the distribution of plants. All right, so their environment impact was limited and local because they had a small population, a low resource use per person, migration, and lack of technology. So this all changed as soon as the agricultural and the industrial revolution started to take place. So the agricultural revolution was a move from hunter-gathering to settled agricultural communities. So we domesticated wild animals and plants. There was slash and burn cultivation. We were shifting cultivation, finding sustainable cultivation, and we had small impact on the environment at first with small plots, population size, and density was low. But as you know, today farming is huge and it has a huge impact on the environment. While we do need it to sustain our population, oftentimes we do overgrow and overwater things that could help limit some of the impact the agriculture has on the environment. In the industrial medical revolution, we had a shift to a dependence on machines. So we were using a lot of fossil fuels, which are not renewable. And this is where we saw the huge increase in air pollution. So we see large-scale production of machine-made goods in factories, and we have factory towns that grew into these huge cities, and fossil fuels powered these machines, as I mentioned. We have a larger and more reliable food supply, which is great, but that also helps support a larger population. So what that does is it aids in the huge increase in population and longer lifespans. So we see an increase in air and water pollution, as well as waste production. So we have a higher standard of living. We see a soil depletion and degradation in the Industrial Medical Revolution, and we also see a drastic groundwater depletion. In the information globalization revolution, this is where we see new technologies that are gaining rapid access to information on a global scale. So, for instance, we just experienced this, right? We knew about coronavirus before it had even entered the States. Or maybe it had entered the States, but we heard about it pretty soon after countries started getting sick. So that is due to the information globalization revolution. So these technologies include telephone, radio, television, computers, internet, automated databases, and remote sensing satellites. All of those things help interconnect the world on a global scale. So this is the ability to respond to environmental problems more efficiently, effectively, and rapidly, but it increases our problems as a whole. And it kind of gives us a reason to create things like the World Health Organization, or WHO. So if we have all of this interconnection, we also need to have organizations that help look out for the global population and not just individual countries. This does increase our information, and it gives us kind of an overload that can cause a sense of confusion and hopelessness, and sometimes it leads to misinformation and not actually knowing what is true. And a lot of people don't fact check things nowadays. They just take whatever they read as factual information, which is can be really hurtful to a population. So we have some different levels of environmental history in the United States. So we've got tribal, frontier, conservation, and environmental. So in the tribal era, we have North America is mostly occupied by Native Americans for at least 10,000 years or so. They practiced hunting and gathering. So that was the first kind of scenario I talked about, where they looked for plants to eat. They fished and they hunted for meat. So they burned and cleared fields as well, and then planted crops. So once they got a little bit better at the hunter-gathering, they kind of learned that they could indeed clear fields and basically plant their own crops so that they could grow whatever they wanted to eat and have an abundance of that. They had a deep respect for the land and its animals. They felt very connected, but they had very little environmental impact, which was great. So if you watch like Pocahontas, for instance, the tribes were very connected to the land. And in that Disney movie, she has a lot of songs that show that she's very connected to the land, like Just Around a River Bend, Colors of the Wind. You listen to those songs, there's some, sense of environmental connection in those songs, which is kind of cool. In the frontier era, this occurred between 1607 and 1890. So this is when European settlers began settling in North America. We viewed most of the continent as having inexhaustible resources. It was a brand new continent. There wasn't many people on this continent, so lots of land, lots of resources, right? They conquered the Native Americans and spread across the continent. Most of you know some of this background. The transfer of public lands to private interests accelerated drastically during the frontier era, due to everybody wanting to settle and own some portion of this new land. In the conservation era, this is between 1832 and 1960. Some started to become alarmed at the scope of resource depletion and degradation in the United States, started to notice that things were not, especially before the Industrial Revolution, it was hard to get some of these without huge machines. Getting like crude oil and other non-renewable oils out of the ground was difficult, and it was, without modern technology, slowly depleting. They urged that part of the unspoiled wilderness on public lands be protected as a legacy to future generations. So they were very good at trying to prepare for the future and making sure that our grandchildren and their grandchildren could still, take part in the beauty that is the United States. So a couple of people were really good at trying to lead this movement. Henry David Thoreau and George Perkins Marsh were two conservationists that helped kind of work with things like the Forest Preserve Act of 1891, which helped to establish the responsibility of the federal government for protecting public lands from resource exploitation. And then other people, which I talked about in the previous lecture, John Muir established the Sierra Club, which was trying to protect our national parks as they exist today. So large areas of wilderness on public lands from human exploitation was kind of the goal to protect. And in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a conservationist, he became president, and his term became known as the Golden Age of Conservation. Teddy established wildlife preserves and more than tripled the size of the National Forest Reserves. So then in 1905, Congress created the U.S. Forest Service to manage and protect the forest reserves. And then in 1906, Congress passed the Antiquities Act, which allows the president to protect areas of scientific or historical interests on federal lands. So this is a big deal because this allowed somebody who is very environmentally conscious, like Teddy Roosevelt, to protect areas that appear to be scientific or historical interest. And then in 1916, Congress passed the National Park Service Act, which was huge, and declared that parks are to be maintained in a manner that leaves them unimpaired for future generations. So this would be like Yosemite. Yosemite is part of this National Park Service. It was one of the first national parks in the United States, and it has led to many more areas in the United States to be developed as national parks and protected under this law. And then in the early 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt persuaded Congress to enact federal government programs to provide jobs and restore the country's degraded environment. And that is still in place today, and it's been growing and increasing in its abilities. And then we see the environmental era, which was from 1960 to 2004. Rachel Carson, and her book Silent Spring are credited with beginning the modern environmentalist movement. So in 1964, Congress passed the Wilderness Act. This authorized the government to protect undeveloped tracts of public land. Land in this system is to be used only for non-destructive forms of recreation, such as hiking and camping. And then during that period, several events increased public awareness of pollution. And then finally, in 1970, we see the first annual Earth Day, which most of you are probably aware happens in April. In 1970, it was a really important agency was developed. Richard Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and it supported the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Between 1977 and 1981, Jimmy Carter persuaded Congress to create the Department of Energy to develop a long-range strategy to reduce the country's heavy dependence on imported oil. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. Reagan cut federal spending for research on energy conservation and renewable energy resources, lowered automobile gas mileage standards, and relaxed federal air and water quality pollution standards. So you'll kind of see in some of these more recent eras, you'll see kind of the back and forth between what Congress and the president kind of have on their agenda, whether they are environmentally conscious or not. And you'll kind of see a back and forth, pull this direction and a pull this other direction. So for instance, with Obama, we pulled, pretty hard towards the environmental standards. and raising them and really trying to make people more aware of them. And then under President Trump, we pulled the opposite direction, trying to relax some of these standards, kind of like Reagan did. All right, in 1989, George W. Bush received criticism from environmentalists for not providing leadership on key environmental issues and continuing support of exploitation of valuable resources. 1993, Bill Clinton appointed respective environmentalists to key positions, vetoed most of the anti-environmental bills, and protected more public land as national monuments in the lower 48 states than any other president. So we got to shift back towards environmentalism. And then 2001, we see George W. Bush did not consult environmental groups, weakened protections of public lands, and develop an energy policy that placed great emphasis on use of fossil fuels and nuclear energy. And then we have the war on terror, which is all over oil. All of it is over the oil in the Middle East. So, yeah. And then we have Aldo Leopold, who's a strong proponent of land ethics, a philosophy in which humans, as part of nature, have an ethical responsibility to preserve wild nature. One of the founders of conservation and environmental movements of the 20th century. Looking at some environmental perspectives. For much of history, our viewpoint has been that Earth's resources are unlimited and that we can exploit them with no fear of them running out. So this has changed drastically, especially since 1970. People are starting to really realize that not everything is finite. The water that comes out of your tap may not always come out of your tap. We are very lucky and fortunate that we don't have to walk miles a day to get our water for simple cooking and living. But that's not the case for every nation, right? The human population was small for most of history, and for all practical purposes, that viewpoint served us well. It got us to where we are today. But the Industrial Revolution, like I've mentioned already, has changed everything. It's made everything much more polluted, and it makes our kind of trying to reverse some of these issues a lot harder. There was a fellow named Jared Diamond who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. And the premise is that because Eurasia is aligned with a long east-west axis in its landmass, Europeans became the dominant civilization. Also asserted that Eurasian animals, cattle and sheep, were easier to domesticate. So that made it a lot easier for modern-day agriculture to exist. He also wrote a book called Collapse, which examines why civilizations have declined and determines that destruction of the environment was key. He asserts 8 factors have contributed to the collapse of past societies. So deforestation and habitat destruction, soil problems, water management problems, overhunting, overfishing, effects of introduced species on native species, human population growth, and an increased per capita impact of people. So I recommend reading these books. They're very informative if you want to know more on kind of what he thinks. These aren't necessarily scientifically based books. They are a little bit more of a societal civilization kind of analysis of the situation. So this says 4 new factors may contribute to the collapse of present-day society. So human-caused climate change, which we already see. A buildup of toxic chemicals in the environment, which we already see. And energy shortages. And then full human utilization of the Earth's photosynthetic capacity. So once our Earth is out of resources, it's out of resources. It does regenerate itself, but that can take millions of years. And humans don't have millions of years to wait around for resources to regenerate. So we need to be conscious about what we use and how we use it. That way we don't run out of resources. And then we have this anthropocentric or technocentric worldview. So this is the human-centered. We already talked about this a little bit. Nature is there to benefit mankind. Humans are not dependent on nature. And most people that are in MedCs, the more economically developed countries, hold this view. So this would be like the United States, China, Canada. Most of us kind of feel that the nature is just there to benefit us, whether it's for its beauty or it's for its resources. Ecocentric worldview, like we talked about, is life-centered, so anything that is living, so respects the rights of nature and acknowledges the dependence of humans on nature. This excludes the soft technologies, favor small-scale, local action, and deep ecologists value nature more than humanity. Then there's communism and capitalism. Communists claim it was the antidote to environmental degradation. After the Berlin Wall fell in Germany in 1989, Western journalists got to see the results of communism. Communist East Germany was a heavily polluted country, and the Buna Chemical Works was dumping 10 times more mercury into a river in a day than a comparable West German plant did in a year. So communism is also not good for the environment. The Native American worldview, there are many but broad generalizations that can be made. Contrary to popular belief, may or may not be environmentally friendly though their population was so low, they had minimal long-lasting effects. So they tend to hold property in common, have a subsistence economy, barter for goods, and low technology. Hold that animals and plants, as well as objects, have a spirituality. So they're a little bit more inclusive in what they deem to have value. That's what this worldview is. Then we see the Buddhist environmental worldview. This is where they believe that all sentient beings share the earth and are codependent. Humans are not more important than other living things. So this is a very holistic approach to looking at the world. Modern Western worldview, this is sort of us, vary from we are the masters of the earth to we have responsibility to be good stewards of the earth. Modern environmental views spring from the Western tradition. So you see a very drastic difference in our population where some just want to conquer and others want to live and nurture everything. Everything has value. So there's some shades of green, dark green. Dissenters seek political change in a radical way as they believe economic development and industrial growth are bad. To light green, where they do not want to work politically for a change, but change their own lifestyles to use fewer resources. And then there's bright green, where they believe that technology and wise behavior changes, we can have economic growth, better lifestyle, be happier, use less resources. Creativity and innovation are keys to a better future. So I think a lot of us live in the light green or maybe even dark green. I tend to live in the light green to bright green, maybe bright green locally. But as far as big government, congressional issues, I don't participate in those. But we have congressmen and congresswomen that we've elected that are very bright green, and they really have, a holistic approach where they want to better the environment, but better economic growth, and everybody be happier, have a better lifestyle, use less resources, all of that. But as long as a big portion of our population can live in the light green, we can do a lot better with how much pollution we put out in the world. All right, so that's the end of environmental history, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye.